Hi guys, welcome back. In this episode, we are going to continue with customization of React Slick Slider. If you haven't watched the previous series, I highly recommend to visit them since we are going to develop our React development from middle to senior level. And this episode, we are going to solve our next task, number 4, by implementing fade animation. If you remember in the previous series, we have implemented the transition animation from slide 1 into slide 2 and vice versa. So in this episode, we're going to implement the fade animation. So let's get started. In order to get the idea how this can be implemented, I can explain this by simple schema. So in the first render, we are going to have the list with the gray color in the schema and the track with the red one and our slides of index number 0, 1 and 2. In order to get fade animation, we somehow have to transform this in this, like in this schema. In order to demonstrate this, their layers, I have changed their height for demonstration purposes. So on our first layer, we will have the index of 0 for the current slide, and on behind we will have this index of 1 and 2. So when we want to change our current slide from 0 into 1, we will change their opacity and z-index in order to get the transition. So in order to implement this, we have to somehow transform from this schema into this one. So in order to do that, we have to position them, all of these slides, into single viewport. We can achieve this by calculating their left position and placing them relative to itself. So positioning 0 index slide would be of course 0, so nothing changes for this slide, while for the next slide with index 1, it has to move from this place into here. So we'll have to move by 1 slide width. While for the next slide, we have to accordingly move 2 slide widths. So as you have figured out yourself, we have to calculate the left position for each slide. So for index 1, it would be 1 slide width. For the index 2, it would be 2 slide widths. So their left position should be negative index multiplied by slide width in order to move all of them into this slide. I think this is clear for now, and let's implement this in our code. First, we have to calculate all of this logic in our track when we will render our slides. So let's create a new function that will calculate style for each slide. So let's call it style and get slide style, and we will need the properties of our track and the index of our child. So let's define this function, get slide style. In the arguments, we will need the spec of our track and the index of type number. Let's define the styles as CSS property, which is the empty object. return the style. We can calculate here the width of our slides, so we can add style width is equal to spec slide width. So now we can add the fade property to our track to get the state. So let's add it. So fade is boolean in this case. If we set the fade into true, we have to calculate new styles for each slide. So this should be for style. As we said, we will change the opacity for each slide. So first, I think we should set the position of relative, and for setting opacity we will need the whether this slide is current or not. So we will need also the current slide. This is type of number. So if our slide is current slide, we can achieve this by checking the index, and the opacity we have to see is 1. If not, then 0. So now we can set the z index of our slide. If it's current slide, then we will set the z index of 999. If it's not current slide, then we will set the z index of 998, which is lower. Now we can set the transition so that our fade animation will be smooth. So transition would be, we'll also need, as we remember in the previous episode, we have the speed property, which is a number in terms of milliseconds. Now we can set the transition to be spec speed in terms of milliseconds. And if we have our slide width, so as you remember, it can be whether it's string or a number. So we have to check if it's a number, so it would be in terms of pixels. So type of slide width for our calculation of left position, spec slide width is type of number. So if it's a number, now we can calculate the left position of our slides. So as we discussed, it's a negative index multiplied by slide width. Slide width. So we have defined new properties. Now we have to pass them, all of them, in order to get the correct numbers. So the first is current slide, then our speed, this is spec speed, and the fade, this will be a fade property. Now we haven't yet defined this property in our inner slide property type, so let's define it here. Fade, it will be a boolean, and in our slider we can define also this property that will be optional, since we are going to define default value to it. So this would be a false. And we can pass this value into our inner slider. Okay, so let's test this out by setting in our app that fade would be false for now. So let's test this out, that our slide is transition is not broken, and if we set the fade true, our slides is not fading in and fading out, it's still transitioning, simply because in our use inner slider we have disabled our transition in of our slides. When we see that there is in our properties we have turned on the fading animation, we have to disable our translation animation. So let's define, if there is no fade animation, use translate. So this should solve the problem. And if you can remember that we have accidentally set our current slides in our track, so let's remove them. We have to remove current slide, speed, and fade. Now the error's gone away. So let's try. It's not working. Let's try what's the problem. There is no styles that we have set, simply because we did not assign this style into here. Now we can remove and replace. Let's try now. Now we see that it's working. That's great. And we haven't broken our animation. And if we notice that there is a problem with transition, so as we have previously solved in translation animation, we can solve them by removing transition when we are still animating. So now we can pass the animating property, so that will be a boolean, and if there is animation, we'll remove the transition. Spec animating, if there's animating, we will add the transition to it. So we can set like this. If there is a animating, assign this, and we have to pass this value right here, animated, and remove this property from our track, animating. Let's see. Now we solved this problem. Now it's still working. Great. If you have noticed, in our previous series we have some problems with our translation. So let's set to false and increase our number of children. Let's see, refresh, and if we click next multiple times, there would be an error with the animation. So it happens simply because that if we click multiple times during the translation, our animating state would be false in some cases. So we have to validate our slide handler even more. So when there is animation, we have to disable this method. So that would solve our problem. So what does this method do? That it will await whenever the animations will be false, so that we cannot mess up the methods. That's great. Thank you for watching. If you find this video useful, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to this channel.